Hi, and welcome to the Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. Before coming to our guest today, I tried to find a way of describing how changes in social media, changes in the web, changes in the media world, which I grew up in and is now effectively gone or is dying. I tried to find a way of bringing it all together, and there's a great danger. You can go off into huge generalizations about fake news, about Russian influence, about the collapse of Western democracy, fake news, the impossibility of finding truth, and they become so general they become meaningless. So I was just struck by, let's stick to one thing, and I'll see if I can introduce our guest by pointing out just how weird and frightening our world is becoming. Let's look at Robert Kennedy Jr., the evolutionary dead end of the Kennedy clan. He's an anti-vaxxer. Now, before I go any further, there've always been anti-vaxxers. Since the invention of vaccines in the 1790s, there's always been people who say, God, injecting poison into yourself, injecting the very sickness you're trying to cure, that's meant to make it better. These are dangerous, pointy heads, intellectuals conspiring against the common man and the common woman. Okay, COVID happened, so anti-vaxxers come out against the COVID injections, as they always have done. 19th century, 20th century now, except that this time the web gives them enormous power. And Donald Trump, who's supposedly this strong man, this great macho leader, is so frightened of their influence on the American right, he has to reject his one achievement when he was president at the end of the 2010s, where he did roll out a pretty successful vaccination program. He has to back away from that and appoint Robert Kennedy Jr., who is going to kill a lot of Americans, who is going to kill the very Americans who voted for Trump, because they are going to be the people least likely to take vaccinations. He has to make him his Secretary of State for Health. It is these kinds of changes to the world we're in that have inspired my next guest, Justin Hempson-Jones, to write a wonderful book. Wonderful is probably the wrong word to use there, but a very good and alarming and interesting book, Influence, which is out in paperback this week. Justin used to work as a behavioural scientist for the British government. I'm not allowed to say what kind of scary stuff he was involved in, because I don't know, the secret police could arrive at the door and drag us off in the middle of the podcast. But anyway, Justin, how are you? Welcome to the Lowdown.
Hello, Nick. I'm very well. Many thanks for having me.
Well, it's a great pleasure, and I really like your book. Did my intro sort of get it right? What is so? Because there's always a danger of recency bias. There's always a danger. You say, "Oh God, our world, it's so extraordinary, it's so frightening, it's so novel." What is novel about the position we're in now?
Firstly, that is not novel, and we should establish that first, which is that our understanding of reality is always contingent. We always argue about what the facts are, and this sort of debate goes back at least as far as Plato, talking about how even the most scientific minded of us could only really see reality as shadows on the wall of a cave, if you like. So, to make that practical, we could see back in the COVID pandemic, even the scientists were arguing about what was happening and what we should do about it, which makes it incredibly difficult for the lay people to understand what's going on. Now, what's changed in our time is that we have a completely revolutionary digital ecosystem, which is changing the nature of how information can be used to exploit the difference between our understanding of reality, to the best of our knowledge, and these kind of social projects that kind of bind us in myths and stories together. And I think this is key to what you're describing here with people like Robert Kennedy pushing these obvious myths.
Yeah, what I liked about your book is you sort of start in the infancy of Homo sapiens. You locate us in our evolutionary history, and for most of our history, we have been small bands of hunter-gatherers, social animals, very dependent on reading clues and cues about how other people react to us, but social animals. And I just wondered, reading you, it's become a bit of a truism to say in the health sector, the reason why Britain, the world, has a problem with obesity is that we evolved as human beings in times of scarcity where food was very, very scarce. And so we can't handle a world where carbohydrates are plenty and we just stuff our guts with endless donuts and get immensely fat. Is that the same with information overload? Are we evolved to handle the level of information that's now thrown at us?
So I think that's a great analogy. So we know that the food that we eat constructs the body that we inhabit, for better or worse. And it's roughly the same with our information diets. The information that we ingest from the information environment is going to construct the thoughts and feelings and beliefs that we have, including what it is we think we're supposed to want and achieve out there in the world. So it's a good analogy.
But I mean, can we? Can we handle this? I mean, the people talk all the time of. Before we go on to some of the big things that are happening, I've seen friends of mine or people, colleagues I work with at the Guardian Observer, journalists I know, go quite mad online. I mean, you can actually see them having a nervous breakdown, becoming so obsessed with getting the clicks. Um, the, 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 well, I mean, I don't know how to. I don't know how to describe it. Occasionally, you'd phone them up and say, "Look, are you okay?" And then if you say to them, "But you need to just stop this. Walk away, mate. You just walk
Yes.
away. Walk away from the internet. Go off into the country. They won't accept it from you." And people, and you talk to them, and I think about them. I think, well, there's the real world where you go for long walks in the country, and there's the online world. But actually, to them, the online world is the real world now. I mean, I'm just wondering if people can handle this.
Yeah. So I think the short answer is we don't handle it very well, and it probably doesn't bring about the kind of goods for us that most of us would think are what we want to achieve, including things, basic things like life satisfaction. But I would also say the reason why these are so potent and are effective is because they do exploit our evolutionary heritage, whether that is being optimized to exploit our attention and grab that, whether it's to kind of spam our memory by repeating things, or whether it's by rousing our emotion, so we're more likely to share things. So essentially, these technologies hack, obviously, our minds. Whether it's good for us, and whether we can handle it, I'm quite doubtful. I mean, we have hugely increased rates of loneliness reported amongst adults, for example, and um, less communication amongst young people, for
Okay.
example.
All right, Justin, can we just go through those three things you said, how psychologically the online world hits us? You said, first of all, spam your memory. What does that
Yes.
mean?
So our memory is built to prioritize things, for example, that are repeated. So if we hear them more often, it's more likely to get cemented into our memory, more likely to cement things that are simple. So those political slogans like "Take Back Control," very simple, memorable. They'll be easy to recall, and they'll therefore more likely influence our behaviour. And also things that are out of the ordinary, a bit bizarre. We're primed to look at those, and focus on those. And of course, that had a survival advantage for us in the past, because the out of the ordinary thing might be a cliched saber-toothed tiger hiding in the bushes or something. But of course now, what's happening is that there'll be this fight for our attention, increasingly bizarre things being said by politicians, because that's more likely to gain our focus, for example, than coming out of some dry but important policy announcements, for example.
Yeah, and you quote actually a story I did in your book about the power of audience capture. That you think you're in control, you think you are this influencer, you are this great guy. You've got hundreds of thousands of followers on YouTube or Twitter, whatever platform you care to name, but you become the prisoner. And you describe a story of a guy I knew called Margid Nawaz, who I really admired about 15 years ago. He had been an Islamist in radical Islamic organizations. He'd been so taken with Amnesty International taking up his cause when he was thrown into jail in Egypt. He thought, no, Western liberalism is great for it. Became a liberal Muslim. He became challenging the extremists in Britain. He set up his own think tank, and I thought, what a bloody guy! What a great guy! Yeah, what amazing thing to do. I actually helped him on his political campaigns, and then he became so in love with his audience. And his audience became ever more right wing, because it's always a danger if you take on radical Islam, you end up with the type of people who hang up around Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin backing you. He didn't recognize that danger. But those people also wanted him to become a real conspiracy theorist, to say that, you know, Donald Trump really won the 2020 election. COVID was all made up by Bill Gates or someone wanting to inject us. And they captured him. I mean, he became what his audience wanted him to be. Is that happening to a lot of us, do you think?
I think so, especially if we're lucky enough to build up an online audience. We're likely to become increasingly captured by them. And I think, firstly, it's well known, of course, um, the more extreme things that we say, on balance, the more attention we're going to generate, the more access to audiences that we have. So that's the first dynamic. But then the second part is, of course, once we've acquired those audiences, we're benefiting from them. So we're gaining, it could be financial interest, but of course, key things like just social, we're all social animals. So we crave that validation from others. And so as the audience demands that we live up to the role we're playing, we might find ourselves becoming increasingly extreme in playing this particular role.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's likely to have happened with people like Nawaz here.
Yeah. Also, I mean, what's interesting is that until recently, people weren't even to reinforce your point about people craving social validation. People were doing this for free on platforms like Twitter. They were getting hundreds of thousands of followers, and no one was paying them. The money was going to whoever owned Twitter or whoever owned, to Facebook or to Zuckerberg and all these billionaires. They were benefiting from people who were just willing to do this, to work for free for them, just to get the attention and the dopamine hits, which is quite an extraordinary thing. I mean, I was brought up in the old journalistic culture where the first thing you were taught was Samuel Johnson's line, "No man unless he's a blockhead writes except for money." But on the internet, people will write, people will generate vast amounts of traffic for nothing because
Yes,
they want the approval.
the
They want.
validation and the status that comes with it. Yes.
I'm just wondering. I was wondering reading your book, and something I really wanted to put to you was this. I mean, the whole tone of what you're saying, Justin, is this is a dangerous world. But if you're a supporter of Donald Trump or of Brexit or of Corbyn, when Corbyn took over the Labour Party, you could say, hold on, Justin, hold on. The old world of the gatekeepers has gone. And the gatekeepers, they weren't always very nice people. People who ran Fleet Street newspapers, Rupert Murdoch, all the rest of them. In the new world, this is what democracy looks like. What you're really objecting to is the true democracy of information, where it doesn't matter if Jeremy Corbyn has no mainstream support. We can get a campaign from online. It doesn't matter if Donald Trump, the Republican establishment, hate Donald Trump. He can win online. And you want to say two things. You want to say this isn't real democracy, and then you want to say people are stupid. People are brainwashed. They're brainwashed by supporters of Trump or by supporters of whichever strongman you will know. They're brainwashed by supporters of Putin. Is that what you're saying?
And not entirely. I think it's somewhere, it's slightly different because I think, firstly, some of these criticisms have some validity. So, for example, what we do see now is this ubiquity of information. So, in some sense, it is more democratic in that everybody can get out there technically and put their story out on social media or other digital means. So, in that sense, it's democratic. And also, there's some truth in the fact that, of course, there were these, a small number of people uh, who could affect the norms of what was said. So the gatekeepers in Fleet Street or elsewhere in the media, they could talk with each other and they would share a set of norms that come from similar social backgrounds, and then that would influence what they put in our attention space. For example, there's some truth in that. But the other side of the coin is that it, in other ways, it's very much not democratic because in the old world, you did have a proliferation of gatekeepers, even if it's a small number, you'd have dispersed power. So you would have different views across the media, and you would have institutions like the BBC, for example, pushing out messages. But now, although it looks democratic, actually, there's very concentrated power in who owns the underlying digital infrastructure. We can see that it's those men who stood behind Trump on his
Yeah.
inauguration, the big tech oligarchs. And of course, they run the infrastructure and they can therefore shape really fundamentally the power, using their power to shape the information environment.
Yeah, as Musk is doing. I mean, millions and millions of tens of millions of people around the world are now. Every time I log on to Twitter, I'm exposed to this rambling fool, frankly. Who I mean, he
Yes.
does seem to me to be quite mentally ill now. What's caused that? I don't know, but he seems to be having a breakdown in public, but a breakdown that is dragging down millions and millions of people in America, who's firing, and most obviously in Ukraine. Justin, actually, I need to say, you are listening to Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen, and our guest this week is Justin Hempson-Jones, the author of Influence, a really important new book on how the web is manipulating our thinking and changing our thinking. And Justin, to kind of I thought you made the point really well. One very interesting point is you look between politicians, the new politicians, the Elon Musk, the Trumps, and gangsters and criminals, and kind of made an analogy of how much power online scammers and online politicians are very similar. Could you explain that?
Yes, for sure. So, of course, the digital world affords great access to us and to those who want to influence us. And so, whether scammers or politicians, they can more easily understand niche audiences and therefore tell them what they want to hear. So it could be, say, an online romance scammer. They will deliberately set up fake infrastructure, so fake personas, for example, and tailor them to the
Fake
target
personas of
sets.
friends and family who will validate what the scammer is saying, so to speak. Yeah, here's my brother, here's my sister, here's my mother, here's my best friend.
Yeah, it could be. Certainly, there are scams that work that way. One in particular that might be familiar to quite a few people is the online romance scam. So this is where somebody approaches a target and they essentially woo them online and typically take advantage of loneliness and longing. So the target set will typically be middle-aged people who are divorced, for example, or have lost partners, and they make themselves look attractive. So fake personas that match the target's age, for example, are attractive in giving the things that they want, for example, so stable jobs, and are able to offer them something that they're looking for. And this is too the type of mechanism that online politicians are using, for example, when they want to influence audiences. So and we know that you can create fake personas and bots that push narratives out. So the bots are there to to take advantage of something called social proof, which is the idea that we take our cues from others around us. So if you pump out messages and it seems to come from a lot of people who are quote unquote like us, then we're more likely to listen to those, even if they don't really represent the people around us. And so this is just one mechanism.
Yeah, is AI going to make this easier?
Yes, it certainly will do unless we do something about it. I think the three things I would say would worry me the most, and none of them, by the way, are deep fakes. So there's a lot of chat these days about deep fake video or audio. So a fake video of a politician saying something
Yeah.
that is to their disadvantage. That doesn't worry me so much because although it will accelerate certain dynamics we've seen before, we're used to seeing fake information, whether that's the written word or hearing people gossip. In some ways, humans are reasonably well equipped to handle that, I would say. Now, the three things that worry me most about AI coming into this space are number one, synthetic focus groups. Now, that might sound a bit technical, but if we think about uh, how we employ focus groups at the moment, you have say political campaign strategists or pollsters. They'll bring focus groups together. They take a lot of time to convene, and out the back of that, that will inform their messaging strategies for a political campaign. Now, with a click of a couple of buttons, we can now do that synthetically if we've got the right data, hypothetically at least. So that massively reduces the effort you have to put in. Now, why this is important is you look at hostile states like China, and they have been stealing lots of Western personal data for many years, and there's been debates about, well, what's that for? Well, something I think that would be really useful for is to fuel synthetic focus groups, so that you're essentially creating the data you need to fuel your influence campaigns. And sorry, I should say one other thing there. One of the key premises of any influence is understand your audience. It's not about me, it's about them, the people I'm trying to influence, and how they see the world. So this
Okay.
is why these mechanisms are so important, because we can get the data very quickly and efficiently, understand where they are coming from. The second aspect is um, that this can then get fed straight into tailored influence messages. So messages built around what the audience want and need to hear. So generative AI can be harnessed to that end. And then the third is the automation of all of this setup. So there's quite an interesting post I saw this week, which was ostensibly a kind of Chinese command and control of 50 social media accounts being run by an AI. So imagine that the AI is running, multiples of these accounts,
Right.
using these automated ways to understand audiences and automated ways to get the message out in a potent way to these audiences.
You are listening to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. Our guest today is Justin Hempson-Jones, the author of Influence, just out this week in paperback, I believe. Justin, what seems quite frightening from what you've just been saying and from reading your book is, in the past, if you like, a propagandist, state, corporate, factional, you name it, they had a choice. They could either go down deep into an individual's history, online history, like a scammer buying details on the dark web, and say, okay, she's lonely, she's probably lonely, she's divorced, but she's got a load of money. She lives in the London suburbs. We think we can target her and scam her. That's one target. Or they could go mass, or could forget about the deep granular detail and go for a mass propaganda campaign to say, believe that it was Ukraine who started the war, not Russia. You
Yes.
seem to be saying now that the way the technology is going is you can do both. You can get a load of detailed information very cheaply and then use it for a mass propaganda campaign.
Yes, I'd say that's right. So, um, to reflect what you're saying, in the past, you ultimately had a decision to make about whether you're going for reach. So, if you're national TV, for example, you're looking at big segments of populations and broad messages, not very tailored, or you go for that tailoring, that depth. But now you don't have to choose so much. You can do both at once. So, you can tailor messages at scale. And so one good example is this idea of micro targeting. Now it's probably not the most impactful way to influence people online, but micro targeting is essentially on social media platforms. We give, the user gives up their personal data, and the quid pro quo is obviously advertisers can then use that data to tailor their adverts to the user. Now propagandists obviously can do the same thing, and they can do it at scale by tailoring those messages. I think quite famously, for example, back in the Brexit referendum, the Leave campaign was quite clever at tailoring some of their messages. So it wouldn't just be, appealing to the folks we might expect them to appeal. So those who are interested in national sovereignty, for example, were those who wanted to reduce immigration. But it could be the more progressive minded. So folks who worried about animal rights, for instance,
Mm.
would receive messages about how the EU was on the side of bullfighting in Spain, for example. So it allows this sort of mechanism. And of course, AI allows that potentially to be automated even further.
Yeah, you just said, Justin, that micro targeting isn't the most effective. What frightens you the most about the way information's going?
I think it's the concentration of power and the fact that it spins this illusion that we have more democratic choice, but is ultimately fundamentally concentrated amongst a small number of oligarchs. And I think the reason this is it's a dynamic too that's hollowed out all of the other sources we might used to have had. So those local these local newspaper sources,
Yeah.
etc. And actually, one thing that should be said is these folks have enormous information power because they can tweak the algorithms, etc. Now, what they don't have, which is actually possibly the real problem, is they don't have a lot of what we call legitimate power. So they're not perceived as having legitimate authority amongst the public in general. And
Okay.
what this means is those that do have that authority can co-opt them quite easily. They look like a very vulnerable, nice golden goose to be co-opted. So, for example, we saw this earlier. We'd see the way these tech platforms could be captured. You'd see countries like you'd see Modi in India or Erdogan in Turkey. They would essentially demand censorship of issues that they cared about, and of course, the tech platforms bowed to them for their commercial
Yeah, I mean,
interests.
let's just quote a couple of the examples you quote. Like in India, for instance, there were protests by farmers, and obviously peasant farming is huge in India, about how the government was hurting them, threatening them. Massive, massive protests. And Modi just says to, I think it was to Twitter, to Elon Musk, that great absolute defender of free speech. He says to Musk, I want these leaders of the farmers' protest silenced. Otherwise, Twitter in India will be for it. And Musk just says, yes, sir.
That's right. And the same thing is arguably happening in the United States today. So, massively concentrating, fusing that information power with the political power, and completely undermining this idea of the separation of powers, for example, that is
You,
supposed to animate the United States.
Yeah, all my life I've been very resistant to accounts of power that basically say, "Oh, there's no difference between a Western democracy and a dictatorship." It's always struck me as a really stupid, far leftist, normally privileged thing to say. Only someone from a very privileged background who's never really feared punishment for their opinions can come out with such a nonsense comparison. That said, that said, you look at the Chinese Communist Party, they've got the Great Firewall of China. But you look at now the way Musk and Trump are working together, there is a kind of element of the Chinese Communist Party in that of the state in the form of Trump and the social media in the form of Musk are now fused together. There's no sense at all that providing a service which can be a challenge to Trump.
Yeah, I think that's right. They are increasingly, unfortunately, aligning, and I would agree with everything you've said. I mean, someone who's lived in a more authoritarian society typically won't draw the comparisons between liberal democracy and authoritarians that you're saying that the far left might do. But yes, there's increasing alignment, and I think the major driver is that ultimately these digital technologies are kind of surveillance platforms. We give them the data, and they exploit the data to influence us or allow others to influence us. And they give great access directly to our minds when we use them. And of course, then there's the concentration of power issue. So in China, the Communist Party is really adept at manipulating public opinion in ways that really enable their society, their state. So before you might have to have more coercive means. It would be the threat of the secret police or what have you knocking on your door. But that's not something you necessarily want to rely on as an authoritarian because it generates resistance ultimately. But now you can allow people to largely let off steam. You can use the algorithms to sort of downgrade how much exposure their views get, but they have so-called quote unquote freedom of speech a little bit more, if you like. But you can also use you can pay people to manipulate that discourse by adding what they want there, and you can also galvanize your own supporters to obviously
Yeah.
get your message out there. And crucially, a crucial aspect of that is to subdue the other side, to overwhelm them, to make them demoralized, to threaten them, for example, but all at arm's length, so it's kind of deniable by the authorities, if you like. And yeah, we are seeing many of those same activities occurring in the United States, especially, but across the West.
Can liberal democracies survive this and still be liberal? I've noticed, I mean, the story that hasn't got much coverage, but it's a fascinating story, is what's going on in Romania, where there was a far right wing pro Russian candidate. Russia absolutely pumps money, social media, TikTok, Twitter behind him. And the Romanian Supreme Court just says, "What the hell?" I mean, this guy comes first in the opening round of the presidential campaign, I think it was. And the Romanian Supreme Court says, "No, we're not having this. Not in our backyard. We're not having this. You're banned from standing. You're a Russian dupe." Now, uh, the Trumpites very revealingly and show how much Trump is Putin's man. Vance and people all say this is outrageous. How can they do this? And in a sense, they've got a point. This guy got those votes fair and square. He might have had Russian money behind him. Well, yeah, so what? People still voted for him. They still chose. Are you saying that people are being brainwashed? All those arguments, all those debates we just had before. And Romania saying, no, to stay a liberal democracy, we must go against the beliefs of liberal democracy, or the marketplace of ideas, free elections, what have you, and just say, no, this guy's a threat, out. I mean, is there going to be more of that, do you think?
Well, I would say hopefully not, but quite possibly. And the problem is there's a sort of paradox, right? So you get these folks with authoritarian impulses at the very least coming to power off the back of being very democratically elected. You see that obviously with Trump, he did win the election quite significantly, and of course controls those parts of Congress. Now they have a democratic mandate and they are then undermining it. So how do you protect democracy by undermining? It's almost the flip side. To protect democracy here, we're saying we have to undermine democracy. So it's paradoxical. I don't know enough about the Romanian situation
No, I was just
to make
using as an
much. Yeah,
example, but and funnily enough, I thought one quite white too. I thought this guy's a Russian agent, got Russian money, ban him. And I suddenly started looking at myself thinking,
yes,
where the hell did
no.
that come from, Nick?
Well, it
Yeah,
will fuel polarization, right? If
yeah.
you supported this guy, and many people, of course, have very legitimate reasons to support this guy, regardless of the circumstances, this is going to, for sure, fuel those grievances, and will definitely look to these people as an anti-democratic move.
Okay.
Um,
All right, Justin. Imagine you're still working for the British government and Keir Starmer calls you in. And Starmer says, all right, Justin, yes or no? I'm busy, man. I'm actually the Prime Minister. Haven't got time for faffing about. Should I ban TikTok? Yes or no?
no, I would say is the answer. I think instead, because again, for the same reasons I just mentioned, it will fuel conspiracy theorists. It does have big implications for freedom of speech, but obviously, it is very likely to be controlled or have the strings pulled by an authoritarian, hostile power. So I think we need to look at it in the round and say, um, the whole information environment and the power of big tech needs regulating. And so, probably what is important here is to make the algorithms transparent and say, look, you cannot operate in this jurisdiction unless we can see exactly what you're doing and we know exactly what change is happening.
Is that happening now? Is the Online Safety Act bringing that?
There is. I am not sure actually whether it's in the Online Safety Act. I know the EU version does include something like this, but also I know there's some uncertainty still about how it's going to be applied. So I think watch this space is the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I also noticed, Justin, that you were talking about the merger of state and corporate power, and I do think Joe Biden's final speech when he warned of this will be remembered by historians, a bit like Eisenhower's speech warning of the military-industrial bureaucracy. I do think Biden's speech will be remembered. That when the EU started talking about, well, look, Twitter's just insane now, and Musk is using it to foment riots on the streets of Britain, neo-Nazi parties in Germany, of all places. And the EU said, we're going to start regulating hard. And JD Vance comes back straight away and says, you do this to Vance, you do this to Musk, forgive me, to Twitter, you do this, and we will hurt the EU's imports to America. So in other words, your world of the merger of state and corporate power is now a reality in Washington D.C., isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. And of course, there we're talking about another paradox where they're talking about freedom of speech. Um, in ways that are quite contradictory. So they're talking about freedom of speech, but actually, what the Republicans are doing in various red states are censoring a lot. And you
Yeah.
see, of course, there's the big impulse at the moment from the Trump administration to censor on any issue related to diversity, equality, and inclusion. And of course,
Or if you're a Palestinian activist on campus and been protesting against Gaza, you suddenly you can be deported, and suddenly all these people who said they believed in freedom of speech, you turn around, and who quite rightly, incidentally, protested against woke censorship on campuses. I and many others warned them at the time, you're digging your own graves here. But they turn around, and where are all these conservatives who are so passionate about freedom of speech? They've all gone, and they all turned out not to be. They're just doing it for partisan advantage.
absolutely. And there's also something that's been lost there too. So we talk about freedom of speech a lot, but when that was conceived in the Enlightenment as a right, a universal right, maybe it wasn't so foreseen that ultimately to speak freely also requires us to have that kind of freedom of being informed from that proliferation of sources, to have better access across the information environment, so that speech is better informed. And of course, there's not much commitment to that over there at the moment either.
I mean, I ended your book feeling quite despondent. I mean, it didn't seem obvious to me how we were going to get out of this. Was I right to be despondent, or are you more optimistic?
I think the jury's out, but it is difficult being an individual and working out how we're supposed to be empowered in this time, because I think there's two things we fundamentally really need to get a grip of. One is a bit more in our gift, and that is what we can personally do to improve our information diets, to ensure we're thinking critically about the information that comes into our mind, ensure we have diversity of opinions, for example, if it's political news, and we think carefully about sources that are coming in. But the real factor really is this question about how can we take back control of our information environment. And that's especially difficult here for a middle power like Britain, because, of course, the platforms we're talking about are based in another jurisdiction. So what is it we can do about them? We can't do a Roosevelt and break them up and heavily regulate them. That's not really within our gift. But I think it's an interesting moment, actually, because in the wider political circumstance at the moment, we're seeing Europe have to fend for itself. And hopefully, this will mean standing up for the interpretations we have of freedom of speech over here, and not submitting to American pressure, and being a bit more independent from the United States, being able to further that so we protect ourselves from the undue influence of big tech and make sure it's really brought under control. And that probably does mean really looking to the state ultimately to do that, which many of us are allergic to for some good reasons. But really, the state is the only
Yeah.
actor that has the power to do that.
But of course, Justin, we are out of Europe, and you do realise why. Looking at the world we're in now, why Donald Trump, go back to 2016 when Cummings and Johnson and Gove and all these people, Farage, who's still with us, secure Brexit, why they cleared it on, why they liked it so much,
Yeah,
because we're a little country now, and we're very easy to push around, very easy for them to push around, I would say. Which is not an option. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry, Justin. You tried to end like a good author at a book festival. You tried to end on a slightly positive note about, yeah, okay, you need to be a bit of a concierge and you need to curate your mentions. And yes, things can perhaps be a little bit better. And I immediately dragged the whole thing down to miserablism.
maybe it'll push us back towards Europe in a constructive way, and we'll work out together. But yes, that remains to be seen.
All right, Justin. All right. Well, look, you have been listening to the Lowdown. Our guest this week, Justin. What's your book called?
It's called Influence. Understand it, resist it, use it. It's
It's
out
out
April 14th
in paperback, yeah?
in paperback.
Available. I don't know if you allow us to use Amazon, but available in all good bookshops, I'm sure. My name is Nick Cohen. I've just got a bit of housekeeping. If you like this program, please give us a nice rating, a 5-star rating, or even a nice review. That'd be helpful. It helps push us up the charts and gives us and spreads the word, allows more people to listen. If you like my writing, you can follow me on Substack, Nick Cohen Substack. Google that, Nick Cohen writing from London. It's really taken off thanks to Trump. Really, thousands of more subscribers are coming in. If you like this podcast, the person to really think, of course, is the producer Andy Hoskin, who, in the most frightful circumstances, produces the most wonderful shows. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.